Did you know that a 10-year-old boy from a small town became one of the 8 greatest Pokémon trainers in the world? This isn't just any trainer. This is Ash Ketchum, the champion of Alola, conqueror of the battle frontier, and the only person to ever defeat Tobias's Darkrai. Tonight we're diving deep into every step of his incredible journey. From that fateful morning when he overslept and changed Pokémon history forever, to his battles against legendary Pokémon, and his rise through the World Coronation series. So settle in, because we're about to explore the complete story of the most determined trainer who ever lived. Every legend has a beginning, and Ash Ketchum's story starts not with glory or triumph, but with fear and a child's desperate need for shelter. Long before he would stand toe-to-toe with Champion Leon or command the respect of legendary Pokémon, Ash was just a little boy who got lost in the woods. It was a rainy day that would shape everything about who he'd become as a trainer, though he wouldn't understand that for years. When Ash was very young, probably no older than 6 or 7, he ventured into the forest near Pallet Town looking for Pokémon. Like many children his age, Ash was filled with curiosity about the mysterious creatures that lived just beyond the edge of his small town. But unlike most kids, he actually went searching for them alone. The weather turned quickly that day, as it often does in the forests of Kanto, and soon Ash found himself caught in a torrential downpour, with no idea which direction led back home. Thunder crashed overhead and lightning split the sky, frightening the young boy to tears as he stumbled through the undergrowth, desperately seeking any kind of shelter. Finally, exhausted and soaked to the bone, Ash discovered a large hollow tree with enough space inside for a small child to wait out the storm. He squeezed himself into the makeshift shelter, shivering and crying, convinced he would never see his mother again. But Ash wasn't alone in the forest that day. As he huddled in the hollow tree, too scared to even peek outside, he heard rustling sounds approaching through the rain. His heart pounded as he imagined all the dangerous Pokémon that might be stalking him. But when he finally worked up the courage to look, he saw something that would fundamentally change his perspective on Pokémon forever. A group of wild Pokémon, just as frightened and wet as he was, had also sought shelter from the storm. There was a small family of Pidgey, their feathers drenched and ruffled, a Rattata that kept shaking water from its fur, and even a cautious Caterpie that inched closer to the warmth. Instead of attacking him or driving him away, these Pokémon seemed to recognize that Ash was just as vulnerable as they were. The young boy, still sniffling from his tears, made a gesture that revealed the kind of person he'd grow up to be. He scooted over in the cramped hollow, making room for the wild Pokémon to share his shelter. Together, the frightened child and the forest Pokémon waited out the storm, keeping each other warm and safe until the rain stopped and the sun broke through the clouds again. This experience planted a seed in Ash's mind about what Pokémon truly were. Not monsters to be feared or tools to be used, but friends and companions who could share in both hardship and joy. Years later, when Ash had mostly forgotten the specific details of that rainy day, the feeling it left him with remained. He often told people he wanted to be friends with Pokémon, not just their trainer, though he couldn't quite articulate why this felt so important to him. The answer lay in that hollow tree, where a scared little boy learned that Pokémon and humans could look out for each other when times got tough. This philosophy would guide every decision he made as a trainer, from his refusal to abandon Pikachu during the Spearow attack to his willingness to sacrifice his bond with Greninja to save Kalos. As Ash grew older, his mother Delia recognized his passion for Pokémon and did everything she could to nurture it. When Professor Oak announced his Pokémon summer camp program, Delia immediately signed Ash up, knowing how much it would mean to him. The camp promised to teach kids the basics of Pokémon care and training, giving them a head start on their eventual journeys when they turned 10. Ash was beyond excited about the opportunity to learn from the famous Pokémon researcher himself, but his enthusiasm got the better of him. The night before camp was supposed to start, Ash was so wound up with anticipation that he could barely sleep, tossing and turning as he imagined all the Pokémon he'd meet and the things he'd learn. When his alarm clock went off that morning, Ash was so groggy from his restless night that he accidentally knocked it off his nightstand. sending it crashing to the floor where it broke into pieces. By the time Delia came to check on him, Ash had overslept by several hours, and the summer camp had already begun without him. He was devastated, convinced that he'd missed his only chance to attend Professor Oak's camp, and spent the rest of that day moping around the house while his mother tried to console him. This would turn out to be the first in a series of oversleeping incidents that would define some of the most important moments in Ash's life, though thankfully Professor Oak offered multiple camp sessions throughout the summer. When Ash finally did make it to Pokémon Summer Camp during a later session, the experience exceeded all his expectations. Professor Oak was patient and kind, teaching the young campers about Pokémon habitats, behavior, and the responsibilities that came with being a trainer. Ash soaked up every piece of information like a sponge, asking countless questions and volunteering for every demonstration. It was during this camp that Ash first held a real Pokéball, learned how to approach wild Pokémon safely, and began to understand the complex relationship between humans and Pokémon that had existed for centuries. One particular day at camp would prove especially significant, though Ash wouldn't realize it until many years later. The campers were participating in an orienteering exercise, using basic navigation skills to find their way through a section of forest near Pallet Town. Ash was so focused on proving himself that he charged ahead of his assigned group, determined to be the first to reach the checkpoint. In his eagerness, he took a wrong turn and found himself in an unfamiliar part of the woods, surrounded by trees he didn't recognize. The irony of getting lost in a forest again wasn't lost on him, but this time he was older and more confident. So instead of panicking, he decided to retrace his steps. As he made his way back through the undergrowth, Ash heard crying coming from somewhere nearby. Following the sound, he discovered a young girl about his age sitting beside a fallen log, clutching her knee and sobbing quietly. She had honey-colored hair and was wearing the same camp uniform as Ash, marking her as a fellow camper who had also gotten separated from her group. The girl looked up when she heard Ash approaching, and he could see that she'd scraped her knee quite badly when she'd fallen. Without hesitation, Ash pulled a clean handkerchief from his pocket, one that his mother had given him with Pokeballs embroidered on each corner, and gently wrapped it around the girl's injured knee as a makeshift bandage. The girl was too shy to say much, but she managed to tell Ash that her name was Serena, and that she'd been following a Poliwag when she got lost and hurt herself. Ash helped her to her feet, even giving her a quick hug to reassure her that everything would be okay, then guided her through the forest back to the main campsite. Serena was grateful but embarrassed by the incident, and they didn't interact much for the rest of the camp session. Still, the encounter left an impression on both children, though it would be many years before their paths crossed again under very different circumstances in the Kalos region. Back home in Pallet Town, Ash's excitement about Pokémon only grew stronger as his 10th birthday approached. He spent countless hours studying Pokémon books, memorizing type matchups, and practicing his throwing arm with makeshift Pokeballs crafted from apricorns he'd collected in the nearby woods. His best friend, Gary Oak, Professor Oak's grandson, shared his passion for Pokémon, and the two boys often talked about their future journeys together. They'd spend entire afternoons debating which starter Pokémon they'd choose, what regions they'd explore, and who would become the better trainer. One afternoon, while fishing at the small pond near Pallet Town, both boys felt tugs on their lines at exactly the same moment. They struggled to reel in what felt like massive catches, encouraging each other as they fought to bring their prizes to shore. When they finally managed to pull their lines in, they discovered that they'd both hooked the same object, a single Pokeball that had somehow gotten caught on both their fishing hooks. The boys argued about who had the rightful claim to the mysterious Pokeball, each insisting that they'd felt the first bite. Their friendly disagreement quickly escalated into a heated argument, with both boys pulling on the Pokeball until the inevitable happened and it snapped cleanly in half. Instead of being angry about the broken Pokeball, Ash and Gary each kept their half as a reminder of their friendship and their shared dreams of becoming Pokémon trainers. They made a pact that day to begin their journeys together and to always remember the bond they shared, though neither boy could have predicted how complicated their relationship would become once they started competing against each other. The broken Pokeball halves became treasured keepsakes that both boys carried with them throughout their early adventures, physical reminders of a simpler time when their rivalry was just friendly competition between best friends. As Ash's 10th birthday drew closer, his anticipation reached fever pitch. He'd already decided that he wanted Squirtle as his starter Pokémon. Drawn to the turtle's cool demeanor and powerful water attacks that he'd read about in Professor Oak's research journals, Gary had made no secret of his intention to choose Charmander, arguing that fire types were clearly the strongest and most versatile Pokémon for beginning trainers. Their good-natured debates about starter Pokémon became a daily occurrence, with each boy trying to convince the other that his choice was superior while secretly respecting his friend's reasoning. The night before their journey was set to begin, Ash could barely contain his excitement. He'd laid out his clothes for the next morning, packed and repacked his backpack a dozen times, and set 3 different alarm clocks to ensure he wouldn't oversleep again like he had for the summer camp. But fate, it seemed, had other plans for the future Pokémon Master. In his enthusiasm, Ash stayed up far too late, double-checking his supplies and rehearsing what he'd say to Professor Oak when he received his first Pokémon. When he finally fell asleep in the early hours of the morning, his body desperately needed rest after days of anticipation and preparation. The sound of his mother frantically knocking on his bedroom door was what finally woke Ash up the next morning, and the sunlight streaming through his window told him immediately that something had gone terribly wrong. His carefully arranged alarm clocks lay in pieces on the floor, victims of his restless tossing and turning during the night. Delia's voice carried a note of concern as she called through the door that Professor Oak was expecting him at the laboratory and that Gary had already left to collect his Pokémon. Ash bolted upright in bed, panic washing over him as he realized he'd overslept on the most important day of his life. Racing through his morning routine in record time, Ash threw on his clothes and rushed toward Professor Oak's laboratory without even stopping for breakfast. The streets of Pallet Town were quiet in the early morning light, and Ash's footsteps echoed off the pavement as he ran faster than he'd ever run before. His heart sank when he reached the laboratory and saw Gary emerging from the front door with a Pokeball in his hand and a smug expression on his face. Gary took great pleasure in informing Ash that he'd not only arrived on time but had also claimed the Charmander that Ash had originally wanted, leaving behind only whatever Pokemon Professor Oak deemed unworthy for a serious trainer to begin with. Inside the laboratory, Professor Oak greeted Ash with understanding rather than disappointment, though he couldn't hide the fact that the situation was less than ideal. The 3 traditional starter Pokemon, Bulbasaur, Charmander, and Squirtle, had all been claimed by trainers who'd arrived on schedule, leaving only one option for the chronically late Ash Ketchum. Professor Oak explained that he did have one more Pokemon available, but it came with a significant warning attached. This particular Pokemon was known for its stubborn personality and its tendency to shock anyone who tried to handle it without first earning its respect and trust. With no other choice available, Ash eagerly accepted whatever Pokemon Professor Oak could offer him, still optimistic that his journey could begin despite the rocky start. When the professor released the Pokemon from its Pokeball, Ash found himself face to face with a small yellow mouse Pokemon with red cheeks and a lightning bolt-shaped tail. Pikachu looked up at Ash with obvious disdain, its ears flattened against its head and its cheeks sparking with electrical energy that promised pain for anyone foolish enough to try touching it. Professor Oak handed Ash the Pokeball and explained that Pikachu was an electric-type Pokemon known for its powerful thundershock attacks and its general dislike of being confined in Pokeballs. From the moment their eyes met, it was clear that Pikachu had no interest in being Ash's partner. When Ash knelt down and tried to pet the small Pokemon, Pikachu responded with a thundershock attack that left the boy's hair standing on end and his entire body tingling with residual electricity. Professor Oak chuckled sympathetically and warned Ash that earning Pikachu's trust would require patience, understanding, and probably quite a bit more electric shocks along the way. Despite the painful introduction, Ash felt a strange connection to the defiant little Pokemon, perhaps recognizing a kindred spirit who refused to simply go along with what others expected of him. The early days of Ash and Pikachu's relationship were defined by mutual stubbornness and a complete lack of cooperation. Pikachu refused to enter its Pokeball under any circumstances, forcing Ash to drag it along on a makeshift leash that the professor had provided for exactly this situation. The Pokémon would shock Ash whenever he tried to give it commands, particularly when he attempted to make it battle against wild Pokémon they encountered on the routes outside Pallet Town. Other trainers they met on the road would snicker at the sight of Ash being dragged around by his own Pokémon, and more than one person suggested that he should return to Professor Oak and ask for a different starter. But Ash had inherited his mother's stubborn streak, and he was determined to prove that he could become a great trainer even with a Pokémon that seemed to hate him. He tried everything he could think of to win Pikachu over, sharing his food, talking to it constantly about his dreams and aspirations, and even sleeping outside under the stars so Pikachu wouldn't have to spend the night in its Pokeball. Nothing seemed to work, and if anything, Pikachu's hostility toward Ash seemed to be getting worse with each passing day. The breaking point came when they encountered their first real danger together, an experience that would transform their relationship from mutual antagonism to unbreakable partnership. The Spearow attack happened on their third day together, when Ash and Pikachu were traveling through a densely wooded area between Pallet Town and Viridian City. Ash had been trying unsuccessfully to catch a wild Pidgey when his inexperienced throwing technique sent the Pokeball flying in completely the wrong direction, striking a Spearow that had been minding its own business in a nearby tree. The angry bird Pokémon immediately called for backup, summoning what seemed like every Spearow in the forest to join it in pursuing the clumsy trainer who dared to attack one of their own. Ash grabbed Pikachu and ran as fast as his legs could carry him, dodging dive-bombing Spearow while desperately searching for somewhere to hide. When Pikachu was injured during the chase, something fundamental shifted in their relationship. Ash could have abandoned the Pokémon that had given him nothing but trouble since the moment they met, could have left Pikachu behind and escaped the Spearow flock on his own. Instead, he scooped up the wounded electric type and continued running, using his own body to shield Pikachu from the relentless attacks of their pursuers. The sight of this human boy, whom Pikachu had shocked and tormented for days, willingly putting himself in danger to protect a Pokémon who'd shown him nothing but hostility, broke through the barriers that Pikachu had built around its heart. By the time Ash collapsed from exhaustion at the edge of a cliff, with the Spearow circling overhead preparing for their final assault, both trainer and Pokémon had reached their limits. Ash looked down at the injured Pikachu in his arms and spoke words that would echo throughout their entire partnership. He told Pikachu that he knew they hadn't gotten along, that he understood why the Pokémon didn't trust him yet, but that he would never give up on their friendship no matter how many times he got shocked. He promised Pikachu that if they could just get through this crisis together, he would spend the rest of his life proving that he was worthy of being its trainer. Pikachu's response was to struggle to its feet despite its injuries and position itself between Ash and the approaching Spearow flock. The small Pokémon's cheeks began to glow with an intensity that Ash had never seen before, crackling with electrical energy that made the air itself seem to vibrate. When Pikachu finally unleashed its Thunderbolt attack, it was unlike anything the young trainer had ever witnessed. Lightning erupted from the tiny Pokémon with such force that it scattered the entire Spearow flock and lit up the sky like a miniature storm. The attack was so powerful that it could be seen from miles away, a brilliant flash of yellow light that announced to the world that something special had just happened in the forests of Kanto. After the Spearow had fled and the immediate danger had passed, Ash and Pikachu found themselves alone together for the first time as true partners. The Pokémon no longer looked at Ash with suspicion and hostility, and Ash no longer saw Pikachu as a difficult assignment to be endured. They had protected each other when it mattered most, and that shared experience created a bond that would only grow stronger with each challenge they faced together. Pikachu finally allowed Ash to pick it up without delivering a shock, and for the first time since leaving Pallet Town, Ash felt like he might actually have what it took to become a Pokémon trainer after all. The aftermath of the Spearow incident brought them their first glimpse of the legendary Pokémon that would appear throughout Ash's journey. As they stood together on that cliff, both exhausted but victorious, a magnificent golden bird Pokémon soared overhead, its feathers catching the sunlight like burnished metal. Neither Ash nor Pikachu had ever seen anything like it before, this majestic creature that seemed to embody everything powerful and mysterious about the Pokémon world. Years later, Ash would learn that he'd witnessed Ho-Oh, one of the rarest and most legendary Pokémon in existence, and that seeing it was considered an omen of great things to come. But in that moment, the tired boy and his new partner simply watched in awe as the legendary bird disappeared into the distance, leaving them with a sense that their journey together was destined for something extraordinary. The sight of Ho-Oh filled Ash with renewed determination and gave him the strength to continue toward Viridian City, where he could get proper medical attention for Pikachu and begin planning the next phase of their adventure. As they walked down the mountain path together, Pikachu finally chose to ride on Ash's shoulder rather than walking beside him on the leash, a small gesture that marked the true beginning of their legendary partnership. The Pokémon Center in Viridian City became their first real stop as official partners, and it was there that Ash began to understand what being a Pokémon trainer truly meant. Nurse Joy, the kind woman who ran the center, examined Pikachu's injuries from the Spearow attack and assured Ash that his Pokémon would make a full recovery with proper rest and care. While Pikachu slept in the center's healing machines, Ash spent hours talking with other trainers who were passing through town, listening to their stories and learning about the challenges that lay ahead on his journey. It was during these conversations that Ash first heard about gym leaders, the Pokémon League, and the incredible trainers who had earned the title of Pokémon Master. The more he learned about the competitive world of Pokémon training, the more determined he became to prove himself worthy of standing alongside the greatest trainers in history. But even as his ambitions grew larger, Ash never forgot the lesson he'd learned during that first crisis with Pikachu. The strongest bonds weren't forged through dominance or control, but through mutual respect, trust, and the willingness to sacrifice for each other when the situation demanded it. When Pikachu woke up, fully healed, and immediately jumped onto Ash's shoulder without being asked, the boy knew that everything had changed between them. They were no longer a reluctant trainer and his difficult Pokémon. They were partners, embarking on an adventure that would take them further than either could have imagined. The journey from Pallet Town to Viridian City had been just a few miles on the map, but it represented a transformation that would define the rest of Ash's life. He'd learned that being a Pokémon trainer wasn't about catching the strongest Pokémon or winning every battle. It was about forming connections that transcended the traditional boundaries between humans and Pokémon. As they prepared to leave Viridian City and continue their journey toward Pewter City and Ash's first gym battle, both trainer and Pokémon carried with them the lessons of their difficult beginning. Trust had to be earned. Respect was given freely only when it was deserved. And true partnership required both parties to be willing to put the other's welfare above their own. These principles would guide Ash through every region he'd visit, every friend he'd make, and every challenge he'd face. The scared little boy who'd hidden in a hollow tree had grown into a trainer who understood that Pokémon were not just powerful creatures to be commanded, but partners to be cherished and protected, no matter what the cost. The road ahead would test this philosophy in ways that Ash couldn't even imagine as he walked out of Viridian City with Pikachu on his shoulder and hope in his heart. There would be gym leaders who questioned his methods, rivals who mocked his emotional approach to training, and situations where his refusal to abandon his Pokémon would seem like foolish sentiment rather than noble principle. But the foundation had been laid in that forest clearing where a boy and his Pikachu had saved each other, and nothing that happened in the years to come would ever shake Ash's belief that Pokémon and humans were meant to be partners, not master and servant. Ash's first real test as a trainer came sooner than he expected, and it arrived in the form of Pewter City's gym leader, a man whose reputation preceded him throughout the Kanto region. Brock Harrison was known for his rock-type Pokémon and his no-nonsense approach to battles, but what most trainers didn't realize was that he'd been forced into the role of gym leader at an impossibly young age when his father Flint abandoned the family to pursue his own Pokémon dreams. At just 15 years old, Brock found himself responsible not only for running a Pokémon gym, but also for caring for his numerous younger siblings, while his mother struggled to keep the family together. The irony of Ash's situation wasn't lost on anyone who understood the type matchups involved in Pokémon battles. Electric-type attacks, Pikachu's specialty, were completely ineffective against rock-type Pokémon, meaning that Ash was walking into his first gym battle with a severe disadvantage that would have discouraged most novice trainers. But Ash had never been most trainers, and his unconventional approach to problem solving was already beginning to manifest itself in ways that would define his entire career. Instead of seeing Pikachu's type disadvantage as an insurmountable obstacle, Ash began thinking creatively about how to level the playing field through strategy and innovation. The battle itself became the stuff of legend among Pewter City residents who witnessed it, though not for the reasons anyone expected. Brock's Onix, a massive rock snake Pokémon that towered over Pikachu like a living mountain, should have ended the fight before it truly began. But Ash had noticed something during his reconnaissance of the gym that most trainers overlooked in their focus on type advantages and raw power. The gym's sprinkler system, designed to keep the rock garden healthy and prevent dust buildup during battles, could be activated if enough electrical energy hit the right components at precisely the right angle. What happened next would be analyzed and debated by Pokémon researchers for years to come, though the official records simply state that Ash Ketchum defeated Brock's Onix through creative use of environmental factors. Pikachu's Thunderbolt attack, aimed not directly at the massive rock Pokémon but at the gym's electrical systems, triggered the sprinkler system and soaked Onix from head to tail. The combination of water and electricity created conditions that allowed Pikachu's subsequent attacks to actually affect the rock-type Pokémon, turning an impossible matchup into a winnable battle through pure ingenuity. Brock was so impressed by Ash's innovative thinking that he awarded him the Boulder Badge, even though the victory had come through unconventional means. But more importantly for Ash's long-term development, Brock became fascinated by the young trainer's approach to Pokémon relationships. He'd watched hundreds of trainers pass through his gym over the years, and most of them treated their Pokémon as living weapons to be deployed against their opponents. Ash was different, talking to Pikachu constantly during the battle, encouraging it when attacks failed, and celebrating its successes as if they were his own personal victories. After the battle, Brock made a decision that would change the course of both their lives. His father had recently returned to Pewter City, with promises to resume his responsibilities as gym leader, giving Brock the opportunity to pursue his own dreams for the first time in years. He'd always wanted to become a Pokémon breeder, specializing in the care and nutrition of Pokémon rather than training them for battle, but family obligations had kept him tied to the gym. Watching Ash's genuine care for Pikachu reminded Brock of why he'd fallen in love with Pokémon in the first place, and he asked if he could join Ash on his journey to learn more about the bond between trainers and their partners. The addition of Brock to Ash's traveling party proved invaluable almost immediately, as the older boy's knowledge of Pokémon care and his cooking skills solved many of the practical problems that Ash had been struggling with since leaving home. But more importantly, Brock served as a mentor figure who helped Ash understand the deeper aspects of Pokémon training that couldn't be learned from books or battles alone. He taught Ash about Pokémon nutrition, the importance of proper grooming and exercise, and how to recognize signs of illness or distress in Pokémon before they became serious problems. Their next major encounter came in Cerulean City, where Ash expected to face another straightforward gym battle, but instead found himself dealing with a situation that was far more complicated than anything Professor Oak had prepared him for. The Cerulean Gym was run by three sisters who were more interested in their water Pokémon shows than in serious battles, and they were quite ready to simply give Ash his badge without making him work for it. This should have been a dream scenario for any beginning trainer, but Ash's competitive nature wouldn't allow him to accept an unearned victory, even when it was being offered freely. The situation became even more complex when a fourth sister, Misty, returned to the gym just as Ash was preparing to leave with his free badge. Misty had been traveling with her own Pokémon team, trying to escape the shadow of her sister's theatrical approach to Pokémon training, and she was furious to discover that they'd been giving away badges to any trainer who asked for them nicely. Her anger at the situation boiled over into a challenge directed at Ash, demanding that he prove himself worthy of the Cascade badge through a real battle against a trainer who took Pokémon seriously. The battle between Ash and Misty became a turning point in both their lives, though neither realized it at the time. Misty specialized in water-type Pokémon and had years of experience that Ash couldn't match, but she was also dealing with her own insecurities about living up to her family's reputation while trying to forge her own identity as a trainer. When Team Rocket interrupted their battle by attempting to steal Pokémon from the gym, Ash and Misty were forced to work together to protect the Pokémon under their care, and their partnership during the crisis revealed how well their different skills complemented each other. Misty's decision to join Ash's journey came partially from gratitude for his help during the Team Rocket incident, but mostly from a recognition that traveling with someone who shared her serious approach to Pokémon training might help her grow stronger as a trainer herself. She'd been feeling stagnant at the gym, going through the motions of water Pokémon shows without feeling challenged or inspired, and Ash's passionate pursuit of his dreams reminded her of why she'd wanted to become a trainer in the first place. The fact that he owned her a new bicycle, destroyed during the Spearow chase when he'd borrowed it without permission, provided a convenient excuse for her to follow him until he could replace it. With Brock and Misty as his traveling companions, Ash began to develop the collaborative approach to Pokémon training that would define the rest of his career. Rather than viewing other trainers as obstacles to overcome, he started seeing them as potential allies and friends whose different perspectives could help him become a better trainer himself. Brock's expertise in Pokémon care complemented Misty's knowledge of battling strategy, and together they provided Ash with a well-rounded education that no single mentor could have offered alone. The dynamics of their three-person group also taught Ash valuable lessons about leadership and compromise that would serve him well in future adventures. Brock was naturally the group's caretaker, handling logistics and ensuring everyone stayed fed and healthy, while Misty provided tactical advice and kept Ash grounded when his enthusiasm threatened to get him into trouble. Ash's role became that of the group's motivator and dreamer, the one whose infectious optimism kept them moving forward even when the challenges seemed overwhelming. Their journey through the remaining Kanto gyms tested every aspect of Ash's developing skills as a trainer, forcing him to adapt his strategies to wildly different opponents and battle conditions. Lieutenant Surge in Vermilion City nearly destroyed Pikachu with his massive Raichu, teaching Ash that evolution wasn't always the answer, and that sometimes staying true to your Pokémon's natural form was more important than pursuing raw power. The lesson resonated deeply with Ash's philosophy about accepting Pokémon as they were, rather than trying to force them into predetermined roles. Erika's gym in Celadon City presented a different kind of challenge, one that tested Ash's ability to overcome his own prejudices and preconceptions. His initial dismissive attitude toward what he perceived as a frivolous perfume shop nearly cost him the opportunity to battle altogether, and he learned that respecting different approaches to Pokémon training was essential for growth as a trainer. The grass-type specialist's elegant battle style and deep connection with her Pokémon opened Ash's eyes to the artistic aspects of Pokémon training that he'd never considered before. Koga's Fuchsia Gym pushed Ash to his limits in ways that had nothing to do with traditional Pokémon battles and everything to do with mental fortitude and creative thinking. The Ninja Master's elaborate traps and psychological challenges forced Ash to rely on his bond with his Pokémon in new ways, using their trust and communication to navigate obstacles that couldn't be overcome through brute force alone. The experience taught Ash that being a Pokémon trainer required much more than just winning battles. It demanded adaptability, intelligence, and the ability to work with his Pokémon as a coordinated team. Sabrina's Psychic-type Pokémon in Saffron City presented perhaps the most terrifying challenge Ash had faced up to that point in his journey. The gym leaders Abra, and later Kadabra, possessed powers that seemed to bend reality itself, trapping Ash and his friends in a nightmarish world where the rules of Pokémon battles no longer applied. It was only through the intervention of a wild haunter who taught Ash that even the most serious opponents could be reached through humor and genuine emotion, that they were able to escape Sabrina's psychic prison and earn the Marsh Badge. Blaine's Cinnabar Gym provided the perfect culmination to Ash's Kanto Gym Challenge, combining everything he'd learned about strategy, adaptation, and the importance of understanding his Pokémon's unique strengths. The Fire-type specialist's quiz-based challenges and volcanic battlefield pushed Charizard to its limits, while testing Ash's knowledge of Pokémon biology and behavior. The victory was hard-fought and completely earned, with no gimmicks or lucky breaks to diminish the achievement. By the time Ash reached the Indigo Plateau for the Pokémon League Conference, he'd assembled a team that reflected his journey through Kanto and his growth as a trainer. Each Pokémon carried with it the lessons learned from their capture and training. From Butterfree's eventual release, to find love with a pink Butterfree, to Charizard's ongoing struggle with respecting Ash's authority, despite their deep bond. The team wasn't the strongest in terms of raw power, but their connection with their trainer and their willingness to fight for each other made them formidable opponents against even the most experienced competition. The Indigo League tournament would prove to be both a triumph and a harsh lesson in the realities of high-level Pokémon competition, but before Ash could face those challenges, an unexpected detour awaited him in the form of Professor Oak's mysterious errand. The GS Ball, a peculiar Pokeball with golden and silver markings that couldn't be opened or transported through the Pokémon transfer system, had somehow made its way to the Orange Islands, and Professor Oak needed someone trustworthy to retrieve it. What seemed like a simple delivery mission would turn into one of the most formative experiences of Ash's early career, introducing him to battling styles and challenges that existed nowhere else in the Pokémon world. The boat ride to the Orange Islands gave Ash his first real break from the intensity of gym battles and Team Rocket encounters, allowing him to reflect on how much he'd grown since leaving Pallet Town. Pikachu had become not just his partner but his best friend, their bond strengthened by countless shared experiences and the mutual trust they'd built through facing danger together. Brock had evolved from mentor to equal partner, someone whose knowledge complemented Ash's intuition and whose steady presence kept the group grounded during difficult moments. Even Misty, despite their frequent arguments about training methods and her obsession with getting her bicycle replaced, had become an integral part of their traveling family. Professor Ivy's laboratory on Valencia Island represented everything that Ash found appealing about Pokémon research, a place where the focus was on understanding Pokémon rather than simply using them for battles. The professor herself was warm and welcoming, immediately putting the young trainers at ease and treating them as colleagues, rather than children who needed constant supervision. Her research into Pokémon behavior and regional variations opened Ash's eyes to aspects of the Pokémon world that he'd never considered, showing him that there were countless ways to form meaningful relationships with Pokémon beyond the traditional trainer-Pokémon dynamic. But the most significant development during their stay at Professor Ivy's lab was also the most heartbreaking for Ash personally. Brock, who had joined the journey to learn more about Pokémon breeding and care, found himself captivated by Professor Ivy's research methods and the opportunity to work alongside a respected Pokémon researcher. The decision to stay at the lab rather than continue traveling with Ash was agonizing for everyone involved, as their trio had become so close-knit that the idea of separating seemed almost unthinkable. Ash's reaction to Brock's decision revealed the depth of his emotional investment in his traveling companions and his difficulty with saying goodbye to people who mattered to him. Even though he understood Brock's reasons for staying and supported his friend's dreams of becoming a Pokémon breeder, Ash couldn't help feeling abandoned and betrayed by the sudden change in their group dynamic. The tears he shed when saying goodbye to Brock were genuine and unashamed, showing a vulnerability that many trainers his age would have tried to hide behind a facade of toughness. The discovery that the Orange Islands had their own unique gym system came as a complete surprise to Ash, who had assumed that his badge collecting days were over until he decided which region to explore next. But the Orange League operated under completely different rules than any competition he'd encountered before, emphasizing creativity and adaptability over raw power and type advantages. The gym leaders, who called themselves Orange crew members, designed challenges that tested every aspect of a trainer's skills rather than simply their ability to win Pokémon battles. Tracy Sketchett's addition to the group brought a completely different energy than Brock had provided, focusing on observation and documentation rather than practical care and support. Tracy's passion for Pokémon art and his scientific approach to understanding Pokémon behavior introduced Ash to new ways of appreciating the creatures he'd been training with for months. The Pokémon Watcher's detailed sketches captured moments and expressions that Ash had never noticed before, helping him see his own Pokémon as individuals with unique personalities and quirks rather than just battle partners. The challenges presented by each Orange crew member pushed Ash to develop aspects of his training that had been neglected during his focus on traditional gym battles. Sissy's target practice competition required Squirtle to develop precision and control that went far beyond anything needed for standard Pokémon battles. The water-type Pokémon had to learn to adjust for wind, distance, and moving targets while maintaining accuracy under pressure. This training proved invaluable for Squirtle's development, teaching it that power without control was essentially useless in real-world applications. Danny's mountain climbing challenge at Naval Island tested the physical conditioning and teamwork abilities of Ash's entire team in ways that no gym battle ever could. The competition required trainers and their Pokémon to work together to scale a treacherous mountain path while carrying heavy supplies and navigating dangerous terrain. Victory went not to the trainer with the strongest Pokémon, but to the team that could maintain coordination and mutual support under extreme physical stress. Ash's success in this challenge demonstrated that his philosophy of treating Pokémon as partners rather than tools had practical advantages that extended far beyond emotional satisfaction. Rudy's Travita Island Gym presented Ash with his first encounter with a gym leader who was clearly interested in more than just Pokémon battling. The young man's obvious attraction to Misty created tension within the group and forced Ash to confront feelings he didn't fully understand about losing another traveling companion to someone else's romantic interests. The battle itself became secondary to the emotional stakes involved, as Ash found himself fighting not just for a gym badge, but for the integrity of his traveling family. The dancing and rhythm-based challenges that characterized many Orange League competitions introduced Ash to the artistic and cultural aspects of Pokémon training that existed in some regions. These battles required trainers to synchronize their movements with their Pokémon's attacks, creating choreographed sequences that were as much about beauty and expression as they were about defeating opponents. Ash's natural athleticism and his deep connection with his Pokémon made him surprisingly adept at these artistic battles, though he never lost sight of the underlying strategy required to actually win. Luana's final gym challenge brought together everything Ash had learned during his time in the Orange Islands, requiring him to demonstrate mastery of teamwork, strategy, and the kind of perfect coordination between trainer and Pokémon that could only come through complete mutual trust. The double battle format forced Ash to think about Pokémon combinations and support strategies in ways he'd never considered before, as victory required his Pokémon to work together seamlessly, while he provided tactical guidance and encouragement. The championship battle against Drake represented the culmination of everything Ash had learned during his first year as a Pokémon trainer, bringing together all the lessons about friendship, perseverance, and creative thinking that had defined his journey through Kanto and the Orange Islands. Drake was exactly the kind of opponent that Ash would face repeatedly throughout his career, an experienced trainer whose skill and power seemed overwhelming until Ash found a way to turn his own strengths against conventional expectations. Drake's team consisted of powerful, fully evolved Pokémon that had been trained to perfection through years of dedicated work and countless battles. His Dragonite in particular represented everything that most trainers aspired to achieve. A pseudo-legendary Pokémon with incredible stats and a move pool that could handle almost any opponent. The battle seemed hopelessly one-sided when it began, with Drake's experience and superior Pokémon making Ash look like the novice trainer he still was in many ways. But Ash had learned something during his travels that Drake's years of conventional training hadn't prepared him for. The bond between trainer and Pokémon could transcend statistical advantages and type matchups when it was genuine and deep enough. Pikachu's refusal to evolve into Raichu had initially seemed like a disadvantage that would limit its potential, but Ash had learned to see it as a choice that reflected the Pokémon's individual personality and preferences rather than a stubborn rejection of growth. When the championship battle came down to that final confrontation between Pikachu and Dragonite, with both Pokémon exhausted from the extended fight and running on nothing but determination and trust in their trainers, the outcome hinged on factors that couldn't be measured in stats or calculated through type effectiveness charts. Pikachu's Thunderbolt attack, powered not just by electrical energy but by months of shared experiences and mutual devotion, finally brought down the mighty Dragonite and earned Ash his first championship victory. The moment when Ash was declared Orange League champion represented more than just personal achievement. It validated an entire philosophy of Pokémon training that prioritized emotional connection over raw power. The trophy ceremony was broadcast throughout the Orange Islands, introducing the Pokémon world to a young trainer whose unconventional methods had somehow produced championship-level results. For many viewers, it was their first glimpse of a training style that would eventually revolutionize competitive Pokémon battling. The victory celebration that followed was subdued compared to what might be expected for such a significant achievement, reflecting Ash's growing understanding that individual accomplishments meant less than the relationships and experiences that made them possible. The real reward wasn't the trophy or the recognition, but the knowledge that he'd found a training method that worked for him and his Pokémon. The Orange League Championship proved that Ash's instincts about friendship and trust weren't just naive optimism. They were legitimate, competitive advantages when applied correctly. The journey back to Kanto with his championship trophy should have been a time of pure celebration. But Ash found himself already thinking about the next challenge, rather than dwelling on past success. The Orange Islands had taught him that there were countless different ways to approach Pokémon training, and each region seemed to have its own unique culture and traditions that could teach him something new. Professor Oak's mysterious GS ball provided the perfect excuse to explore the recently discovered Johto region, where rumors spoke of Pokémon species that existed nowhere else in the world and gym leaders whose challenges defied conventional expectations. The arrival in Hoenn marked a dramatic shift in Ash's journey, one that would test everything he thought he knew about Pokémon training and force him to confront challenges that made his previous adventures seem simple by comparison. May Maple wasn't just another traveling companion joining his group. She represented an entirely different approach to the Pokémon world that Ash had never encountered before. While he'd spent years focused on gym battles and league competitions, May was interested in Pokémon contests, elaborate performances that judged Pokémon and their trainers on style, creativity, and artistic expression rather than raw battling power. The addition of Max to their traveling party brought yet another new dynamic to Ash's group, as the young boy possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of Pokémon that far exceeded his age, but lacked any practical experience with actually training or caring for them. Max could recite detailed statistics about any Pokémon's abilities and evolutionary requirements, but he'd never formed the kind of emotional bond with a Pokémon that Ash considered essential for successful training. The contrast between Max's theoretical understanding and Ash's experiential knowledge created tension that would force both boys to reevaluate their approaches to Pokémon. Brock's return to the group provided stability and continuity that helped Ash navigate these new relationships while adjusting to the unique culture of the Hoenn region. The older trainer's experience with group dynamics and his natural ability to mediate conflicts proved invaluable as personalities clashed and different philosophies about Pokémon training came into direct conflict. Brock also brought with him lessons learned during his time with Professor Ivy, including advanced knowledge about Pokémon nutrition and care that would prove crucial for maintaining the health of an expanded team. Norman's gym in Petalburg City presented Ash with his first glimpse of the incredibly high level of Pokémon training that existed in Hoenn, as May's father had earned his position as gym leader through decades of dedication to perfecting his normal-type Pokémon team. The battle between Ash and Norman became as much about proving his worthiness as May's friend and protector as it was about earning a gym badge, adding personal stakes that elevated the entire encounter beyond a simple competitive match. The revelation that Norman's Slackoth could evolve into the incredibly powerful Slacking shocked Ash and introduced him to Pokémon species whose potential far exceeded anything he'd encountered in previous regions. Slaking's combination of overwhelming physical power and the unique truant ability that limited its actions created a puzzle that required completely new strategic thinking. Ash's victory came not through overpowering Norman's team, but through understanding the rhythm and timing required to exploit the brief windows when Slaking was vulnerable to attack. Max's reaction to watching his father battle against his new friend revealed the complex emotions that surrounded Pokémon training families and the pressure that children felt to live up to their parents' reputations. The young boy had idolized his father's skills for years, but seeing Norman pushed to his limits by a trainer close to Max's own age forced him to reconsider his assumptions about what made someone a great Pokémon trainer. The battle planted seeds of doubt in Max's mind about whether theoretical knowledge was really enough to succeed in the Pokémon world. May's journey as a Pokémon coordinator ran parallel to Ash's gym challenge throughout their time in Hoenn, and watching her struggle with the artistic and performative aspects of contests taught Ash valuable lessons about supporting friends whose dreams differed from his own. Pokémon contests required a completely different skill set than gym battles, emphasizing presentation, timing, and the ability to showcase a Pokémon's natural beauty and talents, rather than just its fighting ability. May's early struggles with these concepts reminded Ash of his own difficulties when he'd first started training, and his encouragement and support helped her develop the confidence she needed to succeed. The Pokémon contest system also introduced Ash to the concept that there were multiple valid paths to Pokémon mastery, and that success could be measured in ways that had nothing to do with winning battles or collecting badges. May's dedication to understanding her Pokémon's personalities and preferences, combined with her artistic vision for how to present their abilities in the most appealing way possible, represented a training philosophy that complemented rather than competed with Ash's own methods. Team Aqua and Team Magma's presence in Hoenn created an atmosphere of tension and danger that Ash had never experienced before, as these weren't petty criminals like Team Rocket, but organized groups with apocalyptic goals that threatened the entire region. Both teams possessed advanced technology and powerful Pokémon that made them far more dangerous than any opponent Ash had faced previously. Their conflicting ideologies about expanding the sea versus expanding the land put them on a collision course that would eventually drag Ash and his friends into events that dwarfed anything that had happened in previous regions. Maxie and Archie, the leaders of Team Magma and Team Aqua respectively, represented fanaticism taken to its logical extreme, as both men had become so convinced of the righteousness of their causes that they'd lost sight of the catastrophic consequences their plans would have for everyone living in Hoenn. Their manipulation of legendary Pokémon Groudon and Kyogre demonstrated a level of hubris that shocked Ash, who couldn't understand how anyone could be arrogant enough to try controlling forces of nature that had shaped the world itself over millions of years. The crisis that erupted when both legendary Pokémon were awakened simultaneously created conditions that pushed Ash far beyond his comfort zone and forced him to take on responsibilities that no teenage trainer should have had to shoulder. When Groudon and Kyogre began reshaping Hoenn's landscape according to their ancient instincts, expanding land and sea respectively without regard for the human and Pokémon communities caught in between, Ash found himself in the position of having to help save an entire region from destruction. Pikachu's mysterious connection to the Blue Orb, one of the ancient artifacts used to control Kyogre, thrust Ash into the center of events that he barely understood but couldn't escape from. The orb's influence on Pikachu transformed the normally cheerful Pokémon into something darker and more aggressive, showing Ash a side of his partner that he'd never seen before and never wanted to see again. The experience taught him that power without wisdom was dangerous regardless of its source, and that even the strongest bonds between trainer and Pokémon could be tested by forces beyond their control. The resolution of the Groudon and Kyogre crisis required Ash to work alongside trainers he'd never met before, including gym leaders and Elite Four members whose skills far exceeded his own. The experience of coordinating with such experienced trainers while dealing with legendary Pokémon gave Ash a preview of the kind of challenges he'd face at higher levels of competition. It also demonstrated that his empathetic approach to Pokémon could be valuable even in crisis situations, as his ability to understand and calm distressed Pokémon proved crucial for resolving the conflict. The aftermath of saving Hoenn from legendary destruction should have made Ash a regional hero, but he was more interested in learning from the experience than basking in recognition. The crisis had shown him how much he still didn't know about Pokémon and the world they inhabited, inspiring him to train harder and study more deeply than ever before. The knowledge that legendary Pokémon possessed power capable of reshaping entire continents was both humbling and motivating, pushing Ash to consider what level of skill and understanding would be required to work with such incredible creatures. The Hoenn League competition that followed represented Ash's most serious attempt at championship-level battling up to that point in his career, as he entered the tournament with a full team of Pokémon that had been tested through regional crises and months of intensive training. His team reflected the lessons he'd learned about regional adaptation, with Pokémon like Sceptile and Corphish representing his willingness to embrace new species and training methods rather than relying solely on familiar strategies. The tournament battles themselves showcased Ash's evolution as a strategic thinker, as he employed tactics and combinations that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of Pokémon abilities and battlefield management. His use of Swellow's aerial mobility, combined with Sceptile's ranged attacks, created battle scenarios that his opponents struggled to counter, while his coordination with Pikachu had reached levels that seemed almost telepathic to outside observers. Morrison's presence in the tournament created personal complications that Ash hadn't anticipated, as their friendship made the prospect of eventual competition emotionally difficult for both trainers. The relationship between competitors who were also genuine friends added layers of complexity to battles that were already challenging enough from a purely strategic standpoint. When they finally faced each other in official competition, both trainers struggled with the conflict between wanting to win and not wanting to hurt someone they cared about. Tyson's ultimate victory over Ash in the Hoenn League quarterfinals came down to factors that had nothing to do with superior strategy or stronger Pokémon, and everything to do with experience and composure under pressure. Tyson had been competing in regional leagues for years longer than Ash, and that experience showed in his ability to make optimal decisions during crucial moments when the pressure was at its highest. The loss was devastating for Ash personally, but it taught him valuable lessons about the mental aspects of competition that would serve him well in future tournaments. The return to Kanto after the Hoenn League represented both an ending and a beginning for Ash, as he'd proven himself capable of competing at the highest levels while also recognizing how much further he still had to grow. The Battle Frontier challenge that awaited him in Kanto would test everything he'd learned during his travels while introducing him to opponents whose skills exceeded even Elite Four members. But first, he had to deal with the emotional challenge of saying goodbye to May and Max, whose own journeys were taking them in different directions than his continuing quest for Pokémon mastery. The Battle Frontier represented something entirely new in the Pokémon world, a collection of facilities designed to test trainers who had already proven themselves through traditional gym challenges and league competitions. Unlike gym leaders who specialized in single Pokémon types, the Frontier Brains each focused on specific battle formats or strategies that required mastery of advanced techniques most trainers never bothered to learn. Scott, the enthusiastic man who served as the Battle Frontier's organizer and scout, had been watching Ash's progress since the Orange Islands, and believed the young trainer possessed the kind of innovative thinking that the Frontier was designed to challenge. Factory head Nolan's Battle Factory presented the first and perhaps most psychologically challenging test of Ash's Frontier campaign, as the facility's gimmick involved trainers using randomly selected rental Pokémon rather than their own carefully trained teams. For a trainer like Ash, whose entire philosophy was built around the bonds he formed with his Pokémon, the concept of battling with strangers was almost incomprehensible. The challenge forced him to demonstrate that his understanding of Pokémon extended beyond his personal team, and that he could form rapid connections with Pokémon he'd never met before. The revelation that Nolan possessed an Articuno, one of the 3 legendary birds of Kanto, elevated the stakes of their battle beyond anything Ash had experienced in a traditional gym. Legendary Pokémon were supposed to be myths, creatures so rare and powerful that most trainers never even hoped to encounter them, let alone battle against them. Nolan's casual partnership with Articuno suggested a level of skill and understanding that dwarfed anything Ash had achieved, making the upcoming battle seem almost impossible to win. Ash's decision to call upon Charizard for the Articuno battle revealed how much his relationship with the proud fire type had evolved since their early struggles with obedience and trust. Charizard's initial refusal to listen to Ash's commands had been one of his greatest challenges as a trainer, but their bond had strengthened through shared battles and mutual respect earned over time. The fire-type's willingness to answer Ash's call and face a legendary Pokémon demonstrated that their partnership had reached the level of complete trust and understanding that Ash strived for with all his Pokémon. The battle itself defied every expectation and conventional wisdom about Pokémon-type matchups, as Charizard's fire attacks should have been severely disadvantaged against Articuno's ice typing. But Ash had learned that battles weren't won solely through type advantages. They were decided by strategy, determination, and the strength of the bond between trainer and Pokémon. Charizard's victory over the legendary Ice Bird sent shockwaves through the Pokémon training community and established Ash as a serious contender capable of achieving the impossible. Arena Tycoon Greta's Battle Arena challenged Ash's ability to think quickly under pressure while adapting to constantly changing battle conditions and rules. The facility's unique format eliminated the traditional back and forth of Pokémon battles in favor of rapid-fire encounters that tested pure instinct and split-second decision-making. Greta herself was a formidable opponent whose fighting-type Pokémon reflected her own disciplined approach to martial arts and physical conditioning. The battles at the battle arena forced Ash to develop new communication methods with his Pokémon, as there wasn't time for lengthy explanations or complex strategies during the rapid exchanges that characterized the facility's format. Victory required the kind of intuitive understanding between trainer and Pokémon that could only come through months or years of working together, as Pokémon had to anticipate their trainer's intentions and respond accordingly without waiting for explicit commands. Dome Ace Tucker's Battle Dome introduced Ash to the spectacle and pressure of tournament-style competition at its most intense, with crowds of spectators and media coverage that turned every battle into a performance as much as a contest of skill. Tucker's flamboyant personality and showmanship-focused approach to Pokémon training initially seemed frivolous to Ash, but he gradually learned to appreciate the entertainment value and artistic expression that could enhance Pokémon battles when done skillfully. The tournament format of the Battle Dome required Ash to pace himself and his Pokémon over multiple consecutive battles, managing energy and resources in ways that single encounters never demanded. Strategic thinking became crucial, as Ash had to consider not just how to win individual battles, but how to position himself for success in subsequent rounds. The experience taught him valuable lessons about long-term planning and resource management that would prove essential for league competitions. Pike Queen Lucy's Battle Pike presented perhaps the most psychologically challenging experience of Ash's Frontier campaign, as the facility's maze-like structure and emphasis on luck and intuition played with trainers' minds in ways that pure battling skill couldn't overcome. Lucy herself was an enigmatic figure whose quiet demeanor concealed incredible skill, with poison-type Pokémon and an uncanny ability to read her opponent's psychological state during battles. The serpentine corridors of the Battle Pike forced Ash to confront his own superstitions and preconceptions about luck versus skill in Pokémon training. The facility's design seemed to suggest that random chance played a larger role in success than most trainers wanted to admit. But Lucy's consistent performance proved that apparent luck was actually the result of superior preparation and understanding of probability. The challenge taught Ash to trust his instincts while also respecting the role that chance and uncertainty played in even the most carefully planned battles. Palace Maven Spencer's Battle Palace eliminated direct trainer commands from Pokémon battles entirely, requiring Pokémon to fight based solely on their own judgment and training, without real-time guidance from their trainers. For Ash, whose entire approach to battling was built around communication and coordination with his Pokémon, the format seemed like an impossible handicap that negated his greatest strengths as a trainer. But Spencer's challenge ultimately validated Ash's training philosophy in unexpected ways, as Pokémon that had been raised with trust and autonomy performed far better in the Palace format than those that had been trained through rigid control and micromanagement. Ash's Pokémon had learned to make independent decisions because he'd always encouraged them to think for themselves rather than simply follow orders blindly. The Battle Palace proved that this approach produced Pokémon who were not just obedient, but genuinely intelligent and capable of adapting to new situations without constant guidance. Salon Maiden Annabelle's Battle Tower represented the pinnacle of competitive Pokémon battling in its purest form, with no gimmicks or special rules to complicate the fundamental challenge of trainer versus trainer in fair combat. Annabelle herself possessed psychic abilities that allowed her to communicate with Pokémon in ways that normal humans couldn't achieve, giving her advantages that seemed almost unfair to trainers who relied on conventional methods. The revelation that Annabelle could actually hear Pokemon's thoughts and emotions directly challenged Ash's understanding of what it meant to have a bond with Pokemon. He'd always prided himself on understanding his Pokemon better than most trainers, but Annabelle's psychic connection represented a level of communication that seemed to transcend anything he'd achieved through conventional means. Her initial victory over Ash forced him to question whether his methods were actually as effective as he'd believed, or if he'd been deceiving himself about the strength of his relationships with his Pokemon. The rematch between Ash and Annabelle became a battle not just between their Pokemon, but between different philosophies about the nature of communication and understanding between humans and Pokemon. Ash's emotional approach, built on trust and shared experiences, proved capable of competing with Annabelle's direct psychic connection when both trainers pushed their methods to their absolute limits. The victory validated Ash's belief that bonds formed through mutual respect and shared hardship were just as valuable as any supernatural ability. Pyramid King Brandon's Battle Pyramid presented the ultimate test of everything Ash had learned during his Frontier Challenge. As the ancient Pokemon specialist possessed legendary Pokemon and decades of experience that made him easily the most formidable opponent Ash had ever faced. Brandon's partnership with the legendary Titans Regirock, Regice, and Registeel represented a level of achievement that seemed almost mythical to most trainers, as these ancient Pokemon were said to choose their trainers rather than being captured through conventional means. The initial battle between Ash and Brandon ended in humiliating defeat that shook Ash's confidence more severely than any loss since his early days as a trainer. Brandon's Registeel demolished Torkoal so thoroughly that the battle felt more like a demonstration of superior skill than a competitive match. The loss forced Ash to confront the reality that good intentions and strong bonds weren't always enough to overcome vast differences in experience and preparation. The psychological impact of losing so decisively to Brandon created a crisis of confidence that threatened to undermine everything Ash had learned about his own abilities as a trainer. For the first time since the Spearow incident, Ash began to doubt whether his approach to Pokemon training was actually effective, or if he'd simply been lucky enough to face opponents who weren't skilled enough to expose his weaknesses. The doubt was so severe that it affected his relationships with his Pokemon, as they could sense his uncertainty and began to question their own abilities as well. The resolution came through Ash's decision to return to his roots and reconnect with the Pokemon that had started his journey, bringing back Charizard, Bulbasaur, and Squirtle to join Pikachu for his rematch against Brandon. The reunion with his original team served as a reminder of how far they'd all come together and reinforced the bonds that had carried them through countless challenges over the years. Each of these Pokemon represented a different aspect of Ash's growth as a trainer and a different lesson about the importance of persistence and mutual respect. The final battle against Brandon's legendary Titans became an epic confrontation that tested every skill Ash had developed and every bond he'd formed during his journey as a trainer. Charizard's fierce independence and pride proved perfectly suited for battling the ancient Dusclops, while Bulbasaur's calm intelligence allowed it to counter Ninjask's incredible speed through careful timing and positioning. Squirtle's determination and versatility gave it the tools needed to stand against Solrock's psychic abilities and astronomical knowledge. But it was Pikachu's climactic battle against Regice that truly encapsulated everything special about Ash's approach to Pokemon training. The legendary Ice Titan possessed overwhelming power and defensive capabilities that should have made victory impossible for an electric-type Pokemon. But Ash and Pikachu's perfect coordination and unshakable trust allowed them to find weaknesses that pure statistics couldn't reveal. When Pikachu finally brought down the legendary Pokemon with a perfectly timed Thunderbolt attack, it proved that bonds forged through friendship and mutual respect could overcome any advantage that power alone could provide. Scott's offer for Ash to become a frontier brain himself represented the ultimate validation of everything he'd accomplished during his journey through the battle frontier. The position would have given Ash security, recognition, and the opportunity to test other trainers' skills while continuing to grow stronger himself. For many trainers, becoming a frontier brain would have been the achievement of a lifetime and the perfect capstone to a successful career. Ash's decision to decline Scott's offer and continue his journey revealed the true nature of his ambitions and his understanding of what it meant to be a Pokémon master. He realized that accepting a permanent position, no matter how prestigious, would mean limiting his growth and cutting himself off from the new experiences and relationships that had driven his development as a trainer. The Pokémon world was vast and full of mysteries that he'd barely begun to explore, and settling down would mean abandoning the very curiosity and drive that had brought him so far. The Battle Frontier victory had proven that Ash could compete with the absolute elite of the Pokémon training world, but it had also shown him how much more there was to learn and experience. Each Frontier brain had taught him something different about the possibilities inherent in Pokémon training. From Nolan's partnership with legendary Pokémon to Annabelle's psychic communication abilities. These encounters expanded Ash's understanding of what was possible when trainers pushed beyond conventional limitations and explored new ways of connecting with Pokémon. May's departure from the group after their contest tie created another bittersweet moment that reminded Ash of the temporary nature of most traveling relationships in the Pokémon world. Their friendship had grown from initial misunderstanding and clash of priorities into genuine mutual respect and support for each other's dreams. The decision to split the contest ribbon rather than determining a single winner perfectly encapsulated the collaborative rather than competitive spirit that Ash had brought to all his relationships. The information about Sinnoh that Gary shared during their reunion sparked Ash's imagination about what new challenges and discoveries awaited him in the next region. Gary's own evolution from rival to researcher had been fascinating to observe, as he'd found his passion in Pokémon study rather than Pokémon battling. Their relationship had transformed from competitive antagonism into mutual respect and genuine friendship, proving that even the most intense rivalries could evolve into something positive when both parties were committed to growth and understanding. The journey to Sinnoh began under circumstances that seemed almost cosmically designed to humble Ash, just as his confidence was reaching new heights. Zekrom, the legendary dragon-type Pokémon of the Unova region, somehow appeared in the skies above Sinnoh and unleashed an electrical storm that temporarily disrupted Pikachu's abilities in ways that no one could explain. The incident left Pikachu unable to use electric attacks properly for several days, forcing Ash to completely rethink his battle strategies and reminding him that no matter how experienced he became, the Pokémon world still held mysteries that could upend his expectations without warning. The psychological impact of Pikachu's temporary power loss was far greater than the practical inconvenience, as it struck at the heart of Ash's identity as a trainer. His partnership with Pikachu had been the foundation of every success he'd achieved, and the sudden vulnerability of his most trusted Pokémon created anxiety that affected his decision-making and confidence. The experience taught Ash valuable lessons about adaptability and the importance of having backup plans. But it also showed him how dependent he'd become on familiar strategies and known quantities. Dawn Berlitz entered Ash's life at exactly the moment when he needed someone who could understand the pressure and expectations that came with being a talented trainer from a famous family. Dawn's mother, Johanna, was a legendary Pokémon coordinator whose achievements had created a legacy that Dawn felt compelled to either match or surpass. The pressure of living up to her mother's reputation, while finding her own identity as a coordinator, mirrored many of Ash's own struggles with expectations and self-doubt. The dynamic between Ash and Dawn differed significantly from his previous traveling relationships because both trainers were dealing with their own insecurities and performance anxiety during this period. Dawn's frequent struggles with contest performance and her tendency to lose confidence after setbacks reminded Ash of his own early difficulties, while her determination to overcome obstacles through hard work and positive thinking reinforced lessons he sometimes forgot during difficult periods. Their mutual support during challenging times strengthened both trainers and helped them develop resilience that would serve them well in future competitions. Paul Shinji represented everything that Ash found troubling about certain approaches to Pokémon training, as the older trainer treated his Pokémon as expendable resources to be optimized for maximum performance, rather than partners deserving of respect and care. Paul's philosophy was built around the idea that only the strongest Pokémon deserved training and attention, while weaker individuals should be discarded in favor of more promising candidates. This approach produced undeniably powerful results, as Paul's Pokémon team was consistently strong and well-trained. But it came at a cost that Ash found morally unacceptable. The philosophical conflict between Ash and Paul's training methods created a rivalry that was fundamentally different from anything Ash had experienced with Gary or other competitors. While previous rivalries had been based on mutual respect and friendly competition, the antagonism with Paul was rooted in fundamental disagreements about how Pokémon should be treated and what responsibilities trainers had toward their partners. Paul viewed Ash's emotional approach as weakness that would ultimately limit his potential, while Ash saw Paul's coldness as cruelty that missed the entire point of human-Pokémon relationships. Their first full battle at Lake Acuity became a defining moment for both trainers, as it forced them to confront the practical implications of their different philosophies under the most intense competitive pressure. Paul's team demonstrated the effectiveness of his harsh training methods, as each Pokémon performed with mechanical precision and unwavering obedience to his commands. The power and discipline of Paul's approach was undeniable, and for a time during the battle it seemed like his philosophy might actually be superior to Ash's more emotional methods. But the battle also revealed the limitations of Paul's approach when his Pokémon faced opponents who could think creatively and adapt to unexpected situations. Ash's Pokémon had learned to improvise and support each other because they'd been encouraged to develop their own personalities and decision-making abilities. When Paul's rigid strategies met Ash's flexible tactics, the result was a contest that pushed both trainers to their absolute limits and forced them to reevaluate their assumptions about effective training methods. Team Galactic's presence in Sinnoh created an atmosphere of cosmic dread that made previous villainous organizations seem like minor annoyances by comparison. Cyrus and his followers weren't interested in stealing Pokémon or making money from criminal activities. They wanted to literally destroy the existing universe and replace it with one designed according to their leader's twisted vision of perfection. The scope of their ambitions was so vast and the implications so terrifying that Ash struggled to comprehend how anyone could be arrogant enough to believe they had the right to remake reality itself. The legendary Pokémon of Sinnoh, Dialga and Palkia, controlled time and space respectively, and possessed power that dwarfed even Groudon and Kyogre's ability to reshape continents. When Team Galactic succeeded in capturing and controlling these cosmic forces, the entire universe seemed to be at risk from their manipulations. Ash's role in stopping their plans required him to work alongside Elite Four members and legendary Pokémon in ways that pushed him far beyond his comfort zone and demonstrated the kind of responsibilities that came with power. The encounter with Azelf at Lake Valor became one of the most spiritually significant experiences of Ash's entire journey, as the legendary Pokémon of willpower recognized something in him that even he didn't fully understand. Azelf's appearance in Ash's dreams and its subsequent spiritual connection during the Team Galactic crisis suggested that certain trainers possessed qualities that legendary Pokémon found worthy of attention and partnership. The experience left Ash with a deeper understanding of his own potential and responsibilities, while also humbling him with the knowledge of how much he still had to learn. The Sinnoh League tournament represented the culmination of everything Ash had learned about high-level competition, featuring opponents whose skills and Pokémon teams exceeded anything he'd faced in previous regional leagues. The quality of competition was so intense that reaching the semi-finals required Ash to employ every strategy and technique he'd mastered, while also developing new approaches to deal with opponents who seemed to have no weaknesses. Tobias appeared in the tournament like a force of nature, a mysterious trainer whose team consisted entirely of legendary Pokémon and who seemed to exist on a completely different level from other competitors. The revelation that someone could actually capture and train multiple legendary Pokémon challenged everything Ash thought he knew about these mythical creatures and their relationship with human trainers. Tobias's presence in the tournament raised questions about fairness and competitive balance that the Pokémon League had never had to address before. The battle between Ash and Tobias became the most one-sided contest in Ash's career, as legendary Pokémon like Darkrai possessed abilities that seemed to transcend normal Pokémon battle mechanics entirely. Darkrai's power to induce sleep and manipulate dreams gave it advantages that no amount of training or strategy could overcome through conventional means. The fact that Ash managed to defeat not only Darkrai but also Tobias's Latios with careful planning and perfect execution represented one of his greatest achievements as a trainer, even though he ultimately lost the overall match. The psychological toll of the Sinnoh League defeat was enormous for Ash, as he'd come closer to championship victory than ever before, while also facing the most overwhelming opposition imaginable. The knowledge that trainers like Tobias existed, with resources and abilities that seemed almost unfair compared to what normal trainers could achieve, forced Ash to reconsider his goals and what it would actually take to become a Pokémon master. The experience planted seeds of doubt about whether hard work and good intentions were enough to reach the absolute pinnacle of Pokémon training. Dawn's departure after the league represented another painful goodbye in a series of partings that were becoming increasingly difficult for Ash to handle. Each traveling companion brought unique perspectives and skills that enhanced his own abilities, and losing them felt like losing pieces of himself that could never be fully replaced. Dawn's decision to continue her coordinator journey independently was completely understandable and supportive, but it left Ash feeling isolated despite his achievements. Brock's final departure hit even harder than Dawn's, as he'd been Ash's most constant companion throughout multiple regions, and had served as both mentor and surrogate older brother during some of Ash's most formative experiences. Brock's decision to pursue his medical studies and become a Pokémon doctor represented the natural evolution of his interests and skills, but it meant the end of an era for Ash. The knowledge that he'd be traveling alone for the first time since leaving Pallet Town was both terrifying and exciting, forcing him to rely entirely on his own judgment and abilities, without the safety net of experienced companions. The arrival in Kalos should have been another fresh start for Ash, but instead it became a journey into the deepest mysteries of the Pokémon world and the most intense personal challenges he'd ever faced. The region itself was unlike anywhere he'd traveled before, with ancient castles and sprawling cities that spoke of a history stretching back thousands of years. The very air in Kalos seemed charged with energy that Ash couldn't identify but definitely felt, a sensation that would later prove to be connected to the unique bond phenomenon that existed nowhere else in the Pokémon world. Serena's reappearance in Ash's life after so many years created a complex emotional dynamic that he struggled to understand at first. The shy girl he'd helped during Professor Oak's summer camp had grown into a confident young woman with her own dreams and ambitions, but she still carried memories of that childhood encounter that had shaped her perception of what Pokémon trainers could be. Her decision to begin her own journey as a Pokémon performer was directly inspired by watching Ash on television during his league competitions, though she never told him this directly until much later in their travels together. The reunion between Ash and Serena carried emotional weight that neither of them fully understood initially, as their childhood connection had left impressions that went deeper than either realized. Serena had kept Ash's handkerchief from their summer camp encounter all these years, treasuring it as a reminder of the kindness and bravery he'd shown when she needed help. For Ash, seeing Serena again triggered memories of that simpler time when his biggest worry was finding his way back to camp, and her presence provided emotional stability during what would prove to be the most challenging period of his entire journey. Clement and Bonnie's addition to the traveling group brought a scientific perspective that Ash had been missing since Tracy's departure years earlier. Clement's background as both a gym leader and an inventor gave him insights into Pokémon mechanics and battle strategy that complemented Ash's intuitive approach perfectly. Bonnie's enthusiasm and lack of filter created countless amusing situations, but also forced the group to slow down and appreciate simple moments that might otherwise have been overlooked in their rush toward the next challenge. The discovery of Mega Evolution in Kalos represented a revolution in Pokémon training that challenged everything trainers thought they knew about the limits of Pokémon power. The temporary transformation that allowed certain Pokémon to exceed their normal evolutionary limits seemed almost magical, requiring perfect synchronization between trainer and Pokémon plus special stones that were incredibly rare and difficult to obtain. For Ash, who had always believed that the bond between trainer and Pokémon was the most important factor in battle, Mega Evolution seemed like the ultimate validation of his training philosophy. But the reality of Mega Evolution proved far more complex than its simple concept suggested, as Ash discovered when he began trying to understand how it actually worked. and why some trainer Pokémon pairs could achieve it while others couldn't. The transformation required not just a strong bond, but a specific type of emotional resonance that was difficult to achieve and even harder to maintain under the pressure of competitive battling. Many trainers who possessed Mega Stones found themselves unable to actually trigger the evolution when they needed it most, leading to frustration and self-doubt about their relationships with their Pokémon. Karina's guidance in understanding Mega Evolution introduced Ash to training methods that pushed the boundaries between Pokémon battling and spiritual practice, as achieving Mega Evolution required trainers to synchronize their emotional states with their Pokémon in ways that bordered on telepathic communication. The process was exhausting both mentally and physically, leaving trainers drained after battles in ways that normal Pokémon contests never did. Ash's natural empathy and emotional openness made him well suited for this type of training, but it also left him vulnerable to the intense psychological pressure that came with such deep connections. The development of the Ash Greninja phenomenon represented something entirely unprecedented in recorded Pokémon history, a bond so deep and complete that the boundaries between trainer and Pokémon seemed to blur during battle. Unlike Mega Evolution, which relied on external stones and specific genetic compatibility, the Ash Greninja transformation appeared to be based purely on the emotional connection between Ash and his Froakie-turned-Greninja. The transformation was so unique that researchers struggled to understand how it worked, or whether it could be replicated by other trainer Pokémon pairs. Champion Diantha's interest in Ash's bond with Greninja elevated the phenomenon from local curiosity to regional significance, as one of the most skilled trainers in the world recognized that something truly special was happening. Diantha's own mastery of Mega Evolution with her Gardevoir provided a fascinating contrast to Ash's natural bond phenomenon, showing two different paths to transcendent Pokémon partnership that achieved similar results through completely different mechanisms. The battle between Ash and Diantha became a showcase for the highest levels of Pokémon training artistry, with both trainers demonstrating techniques and coordination that seemed almost superhuman to observers. Diantha's decades of experience and perfect tactical execution were matched against Ash's innovative thinking and unprecedented bond with Greninja. The fact that Ash managed to gain the upper hand against a reigning champion, even briefly, sent shockwaves through the Kalos training community and established him as a legitimate contender for the highest honors in competitive Pokémon battling. But the Ash Greninja transformation came with a terrible cost that Ash didn't understand until it was almost too late to prevent disaster. The perfect synchronization between trainer and Pokémon meant that they shared not just emotional states, but physical sensations, including pain and exhaustion. When Greninja pushed itself beyond its limits during battles, Ash experienced the same physical stress, leading to collapse and unconsciousness that could have been fatal under the wrong circumstances. The discovery that their bond could literally kill him if taken too far forced Ash to confront the possibility that some connections were too intense to be sustained safely. Team Flare's apocalyptic plans revealed the dark side of human ambition and the dangers that arose when people with power lost sight of the value of individual lives and relationships. Lysandre's vision of a beautiful world cleansed of imperfection required the elimination of most existing life, a goal so monstrous that Ash struggled to understand how anyone could convince themselves it was justified. The scope of Team Flare's threat made previous villainous schemes seem almost quaint by comparison, as they possessed technology and resources that could actually achieve their world-ending objectives. Alan's betrayal cut deeper than any previous deception Ash had experienced, because their friendship had been built on mutual respect for each other's skills and shared passion for pushing the boundaries of what was possible in Pokémon training. Discovering that someone he'd trusted and admired had been working with Team Flare all along forced Ash to question his judgment about people and his tendency to assume the best about everyone he met. The revelation was particularly painful because Alain's motivations weren't purely selfish, as he'd been manipulated by Lysandre's promises to help his mentors research and cure his friend's Pokémon. The climactic battle against Lysandre and his controlled legendary Pokémon pushed Ash and Greninja's bond phenomenon to its absolute limits, requiring them to risk everything to protect Kalos from destruction. The physical and emotional toll of maintaining their synchronized state while battling for the fate of an entire region nearly killed them both, but their willingness to sacrifice themselves for others ultimately provided the power needed to stop Team Flare's schemes. The victory came at enormous personal cost, as the strain of the battle left both Ash and Greninja fundamentally changed by the experience. The aftermath of the Team Flare crisis forced Ash to make the most difficult decision of his entire career as a trainer, as Greninja's new role as protector of Kalos's ecosystem meant they could no longer travel together. The bond that had made them nearly unstoppable in battle also connected Greninja to the life force of the region itself, requiring the Pokémon to remain in Kalos to maintain the balance that Team Flare had disrupted. Ash's decision to leave Greninja behind wasn't just about losing a powerful team member. It was about sacrificing the deepest relationship he'd ever formed with a Pokémon for the greater good of an entire region. The Kalos League Finals against Elaine represented both the pinnacle of Ash's development as a trainer and the most heartbreaking near miss of his entire career. The battle showcased everything he'd learned about strategy, bond building, and competitive battling, while also demonstrating how far he'd come since his early days as a novice trainer. Elaine's victory was legitimate and well-earned, but it came at a moment when Ash had finally seemed ready to achieve his ultimate goal of becoming a regional champion. The narrow defeat in the Kalos League Finals would have been devastating under any circumstances, but coming immediately before the Team Flare crisis and the subsequent loss of Greninja, it created a perfect storm of disappointment and grief that tested Ash's resilience like never before. The combination of competitive failure and personal sacrifice left him questioning everything about his journey and wondering whether the costs of pursuing his dreams were becoming too high to justify. But the recognition and gratitude Ash received from the people of Kalos for his role in saving their region provided a different kind of validation than any trophy or championship title could have offered. The knowledge that his actions had protected millions of lives and preserved an entire ecosystem gave meaning to his sacrifices that transcended personal achievement. The experience taught Ash that being a Pokémon master might involve responsibilities and choices that went far beyond winning battles and collecting badges, requiring moral courage and the willingness to put others' needs ahead of his own desires for success. The transition to Alola represented perhaps the most radical departure from Ash's established patterns that he'd ever experienced, as what began as a simple vacation with his mother transformed into an entirely new way of understanding what it meant to be a Pokémon trainer. The tropical paradise of the Alola region operated under cultural traditions that had existed for centuries before the Pokémon League system was ever established, with island trials and Z-moves representing training methods that prioritized spiritual connection and cultural understanding over pure competitive achievement. Professor Kukui's invitation for Ash to stay and attend the Pokémon school initially seemed like a step backward after years of intensive league competition and world-threatening crises, but it actually provided exactly the kind of healing and perspective that Ash needed after the emotional devastation of losing Greninja and failing to win the Kalos League. The school environment allowed him to rediscover the simple joy of learning about Pokémon without the pressure of constant competition, while the close-knit community of students provided the kind of stable relationships that had been missing from his life since Brock's departure. The island trials that replaced traditional gym battles in Alola challenged Ash to prove himself worthy of Z-crystals through tests that went far beyond Pokémon battling to encompass understanding of local culture, environmental awareness, and spiritual growth. Each trial required him to demonstrate not just his skills as a trainer, but his character as a person, forcing him to confront aspects of himself that competitive battling had never addressed. The trial captains and kahunas who oversaw these challenges were more like spiritual guides than opponents, helping Ash develop wisdom and maturity alongside his battling abilities. Tapu Koko's immediate interest in Ash created a mystery that would define his entire time in Alola, as the Island Guardian's behavior suggested that it recognized something special about the young trainer that even he didn't understand. The legendary Pokémon's decision to grant Ash a Z-ring before he'd completed any trials was unprecedented in Alolan tradition, indicating that the Guardian saw potential in him that transcended normal requirements and expectations. The relationship that developed between Ash and Tapu Koko became unlike anything he'd experienced with legendary Pokémon before. Built on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than crisis-driven necessity. The introduction of Z moves to Ash's arsenal required him to learn entirely new forms of communication with his Pokémon, as the powerful attacks demanded perfect emotional synchronization between trainer and Pokémon to achieve their maximum potential. Unlike the mechanical precision required for traditional Pokémon moves, Z moves drew their power from the depth of feeling and trust between partners, making them impossible to execute effectively without genuine emotional connection. The learning process was frustrating for Ash initially, as his logical mind tried to understand techniques that were fundamentally based on feeling rather than strategy. Lily Aether's presence in the Pokémon school class introduced Ash to trauma and healing in ways that challenged his assumptions about fearlessness and courage. Lily's inability to touch Pokémon due to childhood trauma forced Ash to reconsider what bravery actually meant, as her daily struggle to overcome her fear required more courage than any Pokémon battle he'd ever fought. Her gradual healing process, supported by the entire class, but especially by Ash's patient understanding, demonstrated that some victories were measured not in trophies or badges, but in personal growth and emotional recovery. The mystery surrounding Nebby's true identity as the legendary Pokémon Cosmog created a caregiving dynamic that was completely new for Ash, as he found himself responsible for protecting a Pokémon whose power could reshape reality itself, but who appeared in the form of a helpless infant that needed constant attention and care. The responsibility was overwhelming at times, as Nebby's tendency to teleport randomly could create dangerous situations without warning, but it also provided Ash with insights into nurturing and protection that had been missing from his trainer education. The revelation that the Ultra Beasts posed a threat to Alola's ecological balance thrust Ash into yet another world-saving scenario. But this time his role was as part of a team rather than the primary hero. The Ultra Guardians program taught him valuable lessons about collaboration and shared responsibility, showing him that some challenges were too large for any individual trainer to handle alone, regardless of their skill level. Working alongside his classmates in official capacity to protect their region created bonds that went deeper than normal friendships, as they shared life and death experiences that tested everyone's courage and commitment. The island challenges across Alola's 4 islands pushed Ash to demonstrate mastery not just of Z moves and Pokémon battling, but of cultural understanding and environmental stewardship that connected him to the land itself. Each kahuna represented decades of wisdom about the relationship between humans, Pokémon, and the natural world, offering lessons that couldn't be learned through any amount of competitive battling or theoretical study. Hala's teachings about strength and determination, Olivia's insights about patience and timing, Nanu's lessons about facing darkness and doubt, and Hapu's wisdom about responsibility and leadership each contributed essential elements to Ash's development as both a trainer and a person. The construction of Alola's first Pokémon League represented a historic moment that Ash had the privilege to witness and participate in, as an entire region chose to adopt the competitive system that had defined Pokémon training in other parts of the world. The decision wasn't made lightly, as many Alolans worried that league competition might diminish or corrupt the spiritual traditions that had guided their relationships with Pokémon for generations. Professor Kukui's vision of combining traditional Alolan values with modern competitive structures required careful balance and respect for both approaches. Ash's victory in the inaugural Alola League tournament represented more than just another championship. It validated the integration of different training philosophies and proved that competitive success and spiritual growth weren't mutually exclusive. The tournament itself featured opponents who combined traditional league training with Alolan techniques, creating battle styles that Ash had never encountered before and forcing him to adapt his own methods in real time. The diversity of approaches represented in the competition demonstrated that the Pokémon world was becoming increasingly interconnected while still maintaining regional distinctiveness. The championship battle against Gladion became a fitting culmination to Ash's Alolan journey, as his opponent represented the perfect synthesis of traditional competitive training and Alolan spiritual development. Gladion's partnership with Silvally, a Pokémon specifically designed to be adaptable to any situation, created challenges that tested every aspect of Ash's skills, while also honoring the bonds and growth that had defined his time in the region. The battle showcased not just the power of their Pokémon, but the wisdom and maturity both trainers had gained through their parallel journeys of discovery and healing. The moment when Ash was declared Alola's first champion represented the achievement of a dream he'd been pursuing for over a decade, but the victory felt different from anything he'd imagined during his years of league competition. Instead of triumph over defeated opponents, the championship felt like recognition of growth and community contribution that transcended individual achievement. The ceremony included not just competitive accomplishments, but acknowledgement of his role in protecting the region and supporting his fellow students through their own challenges and development. The exhibition battle against Professor Kukui that followed the league victory revealed the true identity of the Masked Royal and provided Ash with the opportunity to battle his mentor and father figure in an official capacity. The discovery that his teacher had been the mysterious wrestler who'd inspired him throughout his time in Alola added layers of meaning to their relationship and demonstrated that even the most trusted people in his life still held secrets that could surprise him. The battle itself became a celebration of everything Ash had learned in Alola, while also honoring the teacher who'd helped make that growth possible. Tapu Koko's decision to join the exhibition battle as Professor Kukui's final Pokémon created the ultimate test of how far Ash and his team had developed during their time in Alola. The Island Guardian's participation transformed the friendly exhibition into something approaching a sacred ritual, as Ash found himself battling not just for personal satisfaction, but as a representative of everything the region had taught him about the proper relationship between humans, Pokémon, and the natural world. The climactic clash between Pikachu's 10-0-0 Thunderbolt and Tapu Koko's Guardian of Alola became a moment of perfect synthesis between competitive achievement and spiritual fulfillment, demonstrating that the highest levels of Pokémon training could honor both individual ambition and collective responsibility. Ash's victory over the Island Guardian represented not conquest but mutual recognition, as Tapu Koko acknowledged that the young trainer had finally understood the lessons that Alola had been trying to teach him from the moment he'd first arrived in the region. The establishment of Professor Cerise's research laboratory in Vermilion City marked the beginning of an entirely new phase in Ash's development, one that would force him to balance his competitive ambitions with scientific curiosity and collaborative responsibility. Unlike previous adventures where he'd been the primary focus of his own journey, his role as Cerise's research assistant required him to support other trainers' goals while pursuing his own objectives through the newly established World Coronation Series. The change represented a maturation in Ash's approach to Pokémon training, as he began to see himself as part of a larger community rather than just an individual pursuing personal dreams. Go Raboot's partnership brought a completely different energy to Ash's adventures, as his new friend approached Pokémon with the enthusiasm of a collector rather than the bond-focused philosophy that had defined Ash's entire career. Go's goal of catching every Pokémon species in existence seemed almost impossibly ambitious, but his systematic approach and encyclopedic knowledge of Pokémon habitats and behavior provided valuable insights that complemented Ash's intuitive methods. The contrast between their approaches created frequent tension, but also opportunities for both trainers to learn from perspectives they'd never seriously considered before. The World Coronation Series represented the ultimate evolution of competitive Pokémon battling, bringing together the strongest trainers from every region to compete in a ranking system that would determine who truly deserved to be called the world's greatest Pokémon master. For Ash, who had spent years competing in regional leagues and wondering how his skills measured against trainers from other parts of the world, the series provided the perfect opportunity to test himself against the absolute best, while also learning from opponents whose techniques and philosophies had been shaped by completely different cultural traditions. Leon's overwhelming dominance of competitive Pokémon battling created a target that seemed almost impossibly distant when Ash first entered the World Coronation Series ranked in the normal class with thousands of other trainers. The Galar region's champion had never lost an official battle and possessed a team of Pokémon whose power and coordination had been refined through years of championship-level competition. His Charizard, in particular, had become legendary among Pokémon trainers for its perfect battle record and its apparent ability to overcome any opponent through sheer skill and determination. The early battles of Ash's climb through the ranking system tested his ability to adapt to opponents who employed strategies and Pokémon that he'd never encountered before, as trainers from different regions brought completely different approaches to competitive battling. Each victory taught him something new about the global Pokémon training community, while also revealing weaknesses in his own methods that needed to be addressed. The pressure of maintaining a winning record while constantly facing unfamiliar opponents forced Ash to become more analytical and systematic in his approach to battle preparation. Riolu's arrival in Ash's life came at exactly the moment when he needed a new challenge to prevent his training from becoming stagnant, as the fighting-type Pokémon's unique aura abilities opened up entirely new possibilities for Pokémon partnership. The species' natural capacity for sensing and manipulating aura energy created opportunities for communication that went beyond traditional trainer-Pokémon relationships, potentially rivaling even the Ash Greninja phenomenon in terms of depth and power. But unlike the instinctive bond he'd shared with Greninja, developing aura techniques required conscious study and practice that challenged Ash's preference for learning through experience rather than formal instruction. The process of learning to sense and control aura energy forced Ash to confront aspects of himself that he'd never had to examine before, as the technique required emotional honesty and self-awareness that was uncomfortable at times. Riolu could sense Ash's true feelings and motivations with perfect clarity, making it impossible for him to hide behind optimism or determination when he was actually feeling doubt or fear. The Pokémon's brutal honesty about Ash's emotional state created moments of crisis, but also opportunities for genuine growth and self-improvement. Lucario's evolution from Riolu represented not just increased power, but a fundamental change in the nature of Ash's relationship with aura energy and his understanding of what Pokémon partnership could become. The evolved form's enhanced aura abilities allowed for communication that bordered on telepathic, creating possibilities for coordination and strategy that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible in competitive Pokémon battling. The partnership with Lucario gave Ash tools that could potentially close the gap between his current abilities and the championship-level skills demonstrated by trainers like Leon. The Eternatus crisis in Galar demonstrated that even in an era of global communication and advanced Pokémon research, legendary Pokémon still possessed the power to threaten entire regions when their ancient instincts were awakened or manipulated by human ambition. Chairman Rose's attempt to prevent a future energy crisis by prematurely awakening Eternatus created exactly the kind of catastrophe he'd been trying to prevent, as the legendary Pokémon's power proved impossible to control once it had been released from its dormant state. Ash's role in stopping Eternatus required him to work alongside Leon and the legendary Pokémon Zacian and Zamazenta, providing him with first-hand experience of how the world's strongest trainer operated under maximum pressure. Leon's performance during the crisis revealed why he'd never lost an official battle, as his combination of strategic brilliance, perfect Pokémon coordination, and unshakable composure under pressure represented the absolute pinnacle of what human trainers could achieve. Watching Leon in action gave Ash both inspiration and realistic understanding of how far he still had to climb to reach that level. The partnership with legendary Pokémon Zacian and Zamazenta during the Eternatus battle provided Ash with insights into legendary Pokémon psychology that no amount of previous encounters could have taught him. These weren't Pokémon that had been captured or controlled by humans. They were ancient guardians who chose to work with trainers they deemed worthy of their assistance. The experience of earning their trust and respect through actions rather than words taught Ash that legendary Pokémon relationships were based on demonstrated character rather than battling prowess or capture techniques. The aftermath of saving Galar from Eternatus created a bond between Ash and Leon that transcended their competitive relationship, as they'd shared an experience that few trainers could understand or relate to. Leon's respect for Ash's contribution during the crisis translated into genuine interest in his development as a trainer, leading to additional training opportunities and insights that accelerated Ash's climb through the World Coronation Series rankings. The champion's willingness to share advanced techniques and strategies demonstrated the kind of mentorship that Ash had been missing since Professor Kukui's guidance in Alola. The climb through the Great Class and Ultra Class of the World Coronation Series forced Ash to refine every aspect of his battling abilities, while also developing new skills that competitive Pokémon training had never required before. The opponents he faced at these levels possessed decades of experience and resources that made preparation crucial for success. Ash had to learn to study his opponents' previous battles, analyze their strategies and team compositions, and develop specific countermeasures rather than relying solely on adaptability and improvisation during actual battles. The psychological pressure of climbing toward a battle with Leon created mental challenges that Ash had never faced before, as the knowledge that he was approaching the ultimate test of his abilities as a trainer made every battle feel like life or death. The fear of failure became so intense that it occasionally interfered with his performance, forcing him to develop mental training techniques and stress management strategies that complemented his Pokémon training methods. Learning to compete at this level required not just Pokémon skills, but personal growth that touched every aspect of his identity. The reunion battles with previous rivals and opponents throughout his climb created opportunities for reflection on how far both he and they had come since their earlier encounters. Facing trainers like Paul, who had evolved his own methods while maintaining his fundamental philosophy, provided insights into different paths of growth and development that all led toward excellence in Pokémon training. These battles served as measuring sticks that helped Ash understand his own progress, while also honoring the relationships and rivalries that had shaped his journey. The final push toward Master Class and his anticipated rematch with Leon represented everything that Ash had been working toward since he first left Pallet Town with dreams of becoming a Pokémon master. The years of travel, the countless battles, the friendships formed and lost, the legendary Pokémon encountered, and the crises survived had all been preparation for this ultimate test of his abilities and character. The knowledge that he was finally approaching the level where he could face the world's strongest trainer as an equal filled Ash with excitement and terror in equal measure, as success would validate everything he'd believed about Pokémon partnership, while failure would force him to reconsider his entire approach to training and competition. And so, we reach the end of our journey through Ash Ketchum's incredible adventures, though his story continues to unfold with each new day and each new challenge he faces in his quest to become a Pokémon master. From that frightened boy hiding under a tree with wild Pokémon during a rainstorm, to the world-class trainer who stands among the greatest competitors of all time, Ash's path teaches us that every defeat is a lesson waiting to be learned. Every friend is a treasure worth protecting, and every Pokémon deserves respect and love, regardless of their strength or rarity. His refusal to become a frontier brain when Scott offered him the position, his willingness to sacrifice his bond with Greninja to protect Kalos from environmental disaster, his patient growth in Alola, where he learned that victory could be measured in wisdom gained rather than trophies earned. These moments show us that true strength comes not from winning every battle or achieving every goal, but from never giving up on your dreams while never forgetting the values and relationships that make those dreams worth pursuing in the first place. Whether he was learning Z moves under the tropical sun of Alola, mastering the unprecedented Ash Greninja transformation in the ancient castles of Kalos, or climbing the ranks of the World Coronation Series toward his ultimate confrontation with champion Leon, Ash proved again and again that determination, kindness, and an unshakable belief in the power of friendship can overcome any obstacle that stands between a trainer and their dreams. His journey reminds us that becoming the very best doesn't require abandoning the values that make us human, but rather embracing them fully and using them as the foundation for everything we hope to achieve. The legendary Pokémon that appeared throughout Ash's journey, from that first glimpse of Ho-Oh in the sky after the Spearow attack to his partnership with Tapu Koko in defending Alola, recognized something special in him that had nothing to do with his battling skills or competitive achievements. They saw a trainer whose heart remained pure despite years of intense competition, someone who never lost sight of the fact that Pokémon were partners and friends rather than tools to be used for personal gain. This recognition by creatures older and wiser than any human validated Ash's entire philosophy about what it meant to be a Pokémon trainer. As you drift off to sleep tonight, let Ash's story remind you that every journey begins with a single step taken in hope rather than certainty, that every relationship worth having requires patience and understanding to flourish, and that the most important victories are often invisible to outside observers, but profound in their impact on our character and growth. The boy who once got lost in the forest and learned that Pokémon could be friends rather than fearsome creatures grew up to become a trainer whose influence extended far beyond his personal achievements, inspiring others to approach Pokémon training with compassion, respect, and unwavering determination. Remember that, like Ash, every day offers new opportunities for adventure and discovery. Every challenge provides a chance to grow stronger alongside the ones you love, and every setback contains the seeds of future success, if you're willing to learn from mistakes rather than be defeated by them. The world is full of wonders waiting to be discovered, friendships waiting to be formed, and dreams waiting to be achieved by those brave enough to take the first step into the unknown. Just as a 10-year-old boy once did when he left home with nothing but hope and a Pikachu who didn't trust him yet, but would eventually become his greatest friend and most faithful partner in every adventure that followed. The Indigo League tournament would prove to be both a triumph and a harsh lesson in the realities of high-level Pokémon competition. But before Ash could face those challenges, an unexpected detour awaited him in the form of Professor Oak's mysterious errand. The GS Ball, a peculiar Pokeball with golden and silver markings that couldn't be opened or transported through the Pokémon transfer system, had somehow made its way to the Orange Islands, and Professor Oak needed someone trustworthy to retrieve it. What seemed like a simple delivery mission would turn into one of the most formative experiences of Ash's early career, introducing him to battling styles and challenges that existed nowhere else in the Pokémon world. The boat ride to the Orange Islands gave Ash his first real break from the intensity of gym battles and Team Rocket encounters, allowing him to reflect on how much he'd grown since leaving Pallet Town. Pikachu had become not just his partner but his best friend, their bond strengthened by countless shared experiences and the mutual trust they'd built through facing danger together. Brock had evolved from mentor to equal partner, someone whose knowledge complemented Ash's intuition and whose steady presence kept the group grounded during difficult moments. Even Misty, despite their frequent arguments about training methods and her obsession with getting her bicycle replaced, had become an integral part of their traveling family. Professor Ivy's laboratory on Valencia Island represented everything that Ash found appealing about Pokémon research, a place where the focus was on understanding Pokémon rather than simply using them for battles. The professor herself was warm and welcoming, immediately putting the young trainers at ease and treating them as colleagues rather than children who needed constant supervision. Her research into Pokémon behavior and regional variations opened Ash's eyes to aspects of the Pokémon world that he'd never considered, showing him that there were countless ways to form meaningful relationships with Pokémon beyond the traditional trainer-Pokémon dynamic. But the most significant development during their stay at Professor Ivy's lab was also the most heartbreaking for Ash personally. Brock, who had joined the journey to learn more about Pokémon breeding and care, found himself captivated by Professor Ivy's research methods and the opportunity to work alongside a respected Pokémon researcher. The decision to stay at the lab rather than continue traveling with Ash was agonizing for everyone involved, as their trio had become so close-knit that the idea of separating seemed almost unthinkable. Ash's reaction to Brock's decision revealed the depth of his emotional investment in his traveling companions and his difficulty with saying goodbye to people who mattered to him. Even though he understood Brock's reasons for staying and supported his friend's dreams of becoming a Pokémon breeder, Ash couldn't help feeling abandoned and betrayed by the sudden change in their group dynamic. The tears he shed when saying goodbye to Brock were genuine and unashamed, showing a vulnerability that many trainers his age would have tried to hide behind a facade of toughness. The arrival of Tracy Sketchit as a replacement traveling companion initially felt like a poor substitute for the friend Ash had lost, though Tracy's enthusiasm for Pokémon observation and his artistic talents gradually won over both Ash and Misty. Tracy's role as a Pokémon watcher introduced Ash to the scientific side of Pokémon study, teaching him to observe Pokémon behavior more carefully and to appreciate the beauty and complexity of Pokémon in their natural habitats. The sketches that Tracy produced during their travels served as visual records of their adventures and helped Ash see his own Pokémon from new perspectives. Tracy's presence also forced Ash to step up as the group's leader in ways he hadn't needed to when Brock was handling most of the logistics and decision-making. This new responsibility accelerated Ash's maturation as both a trainer and a person, requiring him to think more carefully about the consequences of his actions and the welfare of everyone traveling with him. The leadership skills he developed during this period would prove crucial in future adventures when he found himself responsible for larger groups and more complex situations. The Orange Islands themselves presented Ash with his first taste of regional variations in Pokémon training culture, as the gym leaders there followed completely different rules than their Kanto counterparts. Instead of traditional Pokémon battles focused on type advantages and straightforward combat, the Orange League emphasized creativity, adaptability, and unconventional challenges that tested trainers' problem-solving abilities as much as their Pokémon's strength. These battles required Ash to think outside the box in ways that would serve him well in future regions where standard Kanto battle tactics proved insufficient. Sissy's challenge at the Mikan Gym combined Pokémon battling with target practice, requiring Ash to help Squirtle develop pinpoint accuracy while under pressure from moving targets and environmental obstacles. The experience taught Ash that Pokémon training involved much more than just learning attack moves. It required developing precision, timing, and the ability to perform under pressure. Squirtle's evolution into Wartortle during this period reflected not just the Pokémon's growth in power, but its increased confidence and trust in Ash's guidance. Danny's Naval Gym presented perhaps the most unusual challenge Ash had ever faced. A mountain climbing competition that tested the physical endurance and teamwork abilities of both trainer and Pokémon. The battle took place on the slopes of an active volcano, where the margin for error was literally life and death, and success depended on the ability to work together under extreme conditions. Ash's victory came not through superior Pokémon or clever strategy, but through the deep trust and communication he developed with his team during their travels together. Rudy's Trovita Gym introduced Ash to the concept of using Pokémon in ways that had nothing to do with traditional battling. As the gym leader specialized in Pokémon-assisted glass-blowing and artistic expression, the challenge forced Ash to think about his Pokémon's abilities in completely new ways, finding applications for their moves that he'd never considered before. Pikachu's precision with electrical attacks, refined through countless battles, proved perfectly suited for the delicate work required to create beautiful glass sculptures. But it was Luana's Kumquat Gym that truly tested everything Ash had learned during his travels through the Orange Islands. The double battle format, where two Pokémon had to work together against two opponents, pushed Ash's teamwork philosophy to its limits and required a level of coordination between Pokémon that he'd never attempted before. The battle became a showcase for the deep bonds Ash had formed with his Pokémon and their willingness to trust each other completely even in the most chaotic situations. The final challenge of the Orange Islands came in the form of Drake, the Orange League champion whose experience and skill far exceeded anything Ash had faced before. Drake had been competing at the highest levels of Pokémon training for decades, and his team reflected not just raw power, but the kind of refined strategy and perfect execution that came only through years of dedicated training. The battle between Ash and Drake lasted longer than any fight in Ash's career up to that point, with both trainers pushing their Pokémon to their absolute limits in pursuit of victory. What made Ash's victory over Drake so significant wasn't just that he'd won his first championship, but how he'd done it. The battle came down to a final confrontation between Pikachu and Drake's Dragonite, two Pokémon who represented completely different philosophies of training and evolution. Dragonite was everything a champion's Pokémon should be: fully evolved, perfectly trained, and overwhelmingly powerful. Pikachu remained in its basic form by choice, refusing evolution in favor of growing stronger through training and experience, rather than biological transformation. The moment when Pikachu's Thunderbolt attack finally brought down Drake's Dragonite represented more than just Ash's first championship victory. It validated his entire approach to Pokémon training. He'd proven that bonds and trust could overcome raw power, that creativity and adaptation could defeat experience and conventional wisdom, and that a trainer who truly cared about his Pokémon as individuals could compete with anyone at any level. The Orange League trophy was nice, but the real prize was the confidence and validation that Ash gained from knowing his methods could succeed against the strongest opposition. The return journey to Professor Oak's lab should have been a celebration, but instead it became a bittersweet reminder of how much had changed since Ash first left Pallet Town. Tracy had decided to remain at the lab as Professor Oak's assistant, finding his true calling in Pokémon research rather than continuing to travel as a Pokémon watcher. Ash understood and supported his friend's decision, but the pattern of losing traveling companions to their own dreams was beginning to weigh on him emotionally. The GS Ball mystery, which had triggered this entire adventure, ultimately proved to be one of Professor Oak's most intriguing unsolved puzzles. Despite the renowned researcher's best efforts, the ball remained sealed tight, its secrets locked away behind mechanisms that seemed to defy conventional understanding. Professor Oak's decision to send the ball to his colleague Kurt in Azalea Town would eventually provide answers, but for now it remained an enigma that sparked Ash's curiosity about the deeper mysteries of the Pokémon world. Brock's return to the group came at exactly the right time, as Ash was struggling with feelings of loneliness and uncertainty about what direction his journey should take next. The older trainer had learned valuable lessons about Pokémon breeding during his time with Professor Ivy, but he'd also discovered that his true passion lay in traveling and experiencing the Pokémon world firsthand, rather than studying it from the confines of a laboratory. His decision to rejoin Ash's adventure brought stability back to the group and gave Ash the emotional support he needed to tackle the challenges that lay ahead. The news about the Johto region and its unique Pokémon sparked Ash's imagination in ways that even the Orange Islands hadn't managed to achieve. Here was an entire region filled with Pokémon species that existed nowhere else in the world. Gym leaders with completely different approaches to battle, and mysteries that had never been solved by any trainer. The possibility of encountering legendary Pokémon like Ho-Oh again, this time with the knowledge and experience to appreciate such a rare sighting, filled Ash with excitement about what new adventures awaited him. But perhaps most importantly, the Orange Islands experience had taught Ash that being a Pokémon trainer was about much more than collecting gym badges or winning tournaments. It was about forming connections with Pokémon and people from all walks of life, learning from every experience, whether positive or negative, and growing stronger not just as a battler but as a person. These lessons would prove invaluable in Johto, where the challenges would be greater and the stakes higher than anything Ash had faced before. The Orange Islands had also introduced Ash to the concept of regional differences in Pokémon training culture, showing him that there was no single correct way to approach the relationship between trainers and Pokémon. The creativity and innovation he'd witnessed in the Orange League battles had expanded his understanding of what was possible when trainers thought beyond conventional limitations and trusted in their Pokémon's abilities. This open-mindedness would serve him well in future regions where he'd encounter training methods and battle styles that challenged everything he thought he knew about Pokémon.